Hey, buddy, why are you sitting alone in an empty restaurant?
Just having my coffee. Why?
I passed by a few times. You've been here a while. Looks like you're casing the place.
No, I'm just enjoying my drink.
I know the owner, and he doesn't trust people like you around her. Let me see your ID.
I don't have to give you ID without cause.
Then stand up. I'm not playing
That's
around.
funny, because I'm the owner of this.
The sun had barely risen when Raymond Carter unlocked the glass door of Carter's Diner, the restaurant he had owned and operated for 17 years. It was 5:15 in the morning on a cold Tuesday in March, and Raymond had the same routine every morning since he inherited the establishment from his father. Enter through the front door, turn off the alarm, turn on the lights one by one, brew the coffee his regular customers expected to be fresh at 6 o'clock, and then sit at his favorite table by the window to have the first cup of the day while reviewing accounts and stock orders. It was his moment of peace before the diner filled with voices, laughter, and the noise of dishes. Raymond was sitting there, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, his reading glasses resting on the tip of his nose as he looked at a stack of invoices, when he heard the front doorbell ring. Raymond was 32 years old, with a youthful appearance that frequently made people doubt he actually owned the business. He wore faded jeans, a red flannel shirt, and his blue apron with Carter's logo embroidered on it was hanging on a nearby chair. His hands were calloused from years working in the kitchen, first alongside his father, then alone when cancer took the older man just 2 years ago. The diner was located on a busy corner downtown, a red brick building with a vintage neon sign that said Carter's since 1950, when Raymond's grandfather first opened the place. Raymond was the third generation to run Carter's Diner, having taken over the business at 30, younger than most restaurant owners in the area. Raymond looked up from the pile of papers when the bell rang. A young police officer stood near the entrance, looking around the empty diner with a serious expression. The officer looked about 24, 25 at most, with a uniform so new it still had creases from when it was taken out of the package. The badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Raymond set the coffee mug on the table and smiled with that warm smile he used with all customers. He waved and called out to the officer, saying good morning, explaining the diner didn't officially open for another 40 minutes, but that he'd be happy to serve coffee if the officer needed it. He had served police officers since taking over the business. Some of the older officers from the department were regular customers who had known Raymond since he was a child, when he helped his father at the counter. But the officer's response wasn't what Raymond expected. Instead of accepting the coffee or thanking him and leaving, the young officer walked further into the diner and asked what Raymond was doing there. The tone wasn't friendly or curious. It was suspicious, almost accusatory. Raymond blinked, confused for a moment, thinking maybe he hadn't heard correctly. He pointed to the coffee mug on the table, to the papers spread out, and said with a light laugh that he was having coffee and taking care of paperwork before opening, that he did this every morning. But the officer didn't smile back. His eyes scanned Raymond from head to toe, then swept the empty diner, and then returned to Raymond with that intensity that comes from nervousness mixed with misdirected authority. The officer, whose badge identified him as Jay Morrison, said he had received a call about a possible break-in at the address. Someone had seen a man alone inside the restaurant earlier than normal business hours and reported suspicious activity. Raymond almost laughed because the situation seemed absurd. He placed his reading glasses on the table and calmly explained he was the owner of the restaurant, that he was there every morning at this time for years. He pointed to the walls covered with photos of him with his father and grandfather over the decades, to the sign with the name Carter on the window, to the framed business license hanging near the register with his name clearly printed. But Officer Morrison didn't look at any of those things. His eyes remained fixed on Raymond, and Raymond felt that familiar and terrible sensation in his stomach. He had lived long enough as a black man to recognize when someone had already decided who he was based solely on the color of his skin. Morrison took a step closer to the table where Raymond was sitting and said Raymond needed to stand up and exit the establishment immediately while the situation was investigated. And it was at that moment Raymond realized this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple conversation. He was looking at a rookie cop who had made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice and was too determined or too proud to admit the mistake, even when the truth was stamped on every inch of the restaurant around them. Raymond remained seated for a moment, processing what Morrison had just said. He looked at the steaming coffee mug, at the papers spread on the table, and then back at the young officer who clearly had no idea of the absurdity he was requesting. Raymond took a deep breath and responded with a forced calm that came from years of dealing with difficult situations. He said he wasn't going to leave because he was in his own restaurant, taking care of his own business, and that he hadn't committed any crime. He offered again to show his ID, the property deed that was locked in the back office, or to call any of several veteran officers from the department who knew him personally. Morrison didn't like that answer. His hand moved instinctively to his belt, resting near the baton. He said Raymond was being uncooperative, that refusing to follow a police officer's instructions was a serious offense. His voice got louder, more insistent, filling the empty diner with a tension that hadn't existed minutes before. Raymond felt anger beginning to boil beneath his calm exterior. He had woken up at 4:30 in the morning, as he did every day, to prepare a business that fed hundreds of people per week. And now he was being treated like a criminal on his own property by a cop who probably still lived with his parents. Raymond stood up slowly, his hands visible, nothing threatening in his movements. He was tall enough to look Morrison directly in the eyes. With a firm but controlled voice, Raymond said he was cooperating by offering all the necessary information to verify his identity. That he had no legal obligation to leave his own property based on an unfounded accusation, that Morrison was making a serious mistake and should call his supervisor before making the situation even worse. Every word was measured, careful, because Raymond knew anything he said could be twisted, misinterpreted, used against him. But Morrison was now committed to his narrative. He had decided Raymond was suspicious, and admitting the mistake would mean admitting he had made assumptions based purely on race. So instead of backing down, Morrison doubled down. He said Raymond was under investigation for possible break-in, and that if he didn't leave the establishment voluntarily, he would be removed by force. Raymond couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked around the diner, at the chairs his grandfather had bought at an auction in 1952, at the marble counter his father had installed with his own hands, at the framed photos showing 3 generations of the Carter family serving the community. That's when the front door opened again, and Maria Rodriguez entered, Carter's head cook, who had worked there for 12 years. She always arrived 15 minutes early, a woman in her 50s with enough energy for 3 people. Maria stopped abruptly when she saw the scene, her eyes going from Raymond to the officer and back. She immediately realized something was very wrong. Maria dropped her bag on a nearby chair and asked what was going on, directing the question to both Raymond and Morrison. Her voice had that protective maternal tone she used when anyone messed with her kitchen or her boss. Morrison turned to Maria and ordered her to exit the establishment as well, saying he was in the middle of an investigation. Maria looked at him as if he had completely lost his sanity. She pointed to Raymond and said in a loud and clear voice that this man was Raymond Carter, the owner of Carter's Diner, that he had worked in that restaurant since he was 15 years old, and that if Morrison didn't take his hand off the baton and start using his brain, she would personally call the police chief, who happened to have coffee there every Friday. The indignation in her voice was palpable, echoing through the walls of the empty diner with a maternal fury that made even Morrison hesitate for a fraction of a second. Morrison looked at Maria, then at Raymond, and for the first time since he entered the diner, a shadow of doubt crossed his face. But he had gone too far to back down now without looking completely incompetent. So instead of admitting the obvious mistake, Morrison said that both Raymond and Maria needed to provide identification and that until the situation was clarified, they couldn't remain in the establishment. Maria practically exploded. She pulled her wallet from her bag, took out her ID, and practically threw it in Morrison's direction, saying there was her identification and that he could verify she had worked there for more than a decade. Then she grabbed her cell phone and started dialing. Raymond gently placed his hand on Maria's shoulder, asking her to wait a moment before calling. He didn't want the situation to escalate further, especially with Maria involved. He knew nervous rookie cops made bad decisions when they felt publicly challenged. Raymond turned to Morrison and said one last time, with a patience that was rapidly running out, that he was the legitimate owner of Carter's Diner, that he had all the necessary documentation, and that all Morrison needed to do was check the business registry or call literally any other officer from the department. But Morrison had crossed a point of no return in his own mind. Morrison grabbed the radio attached to his shoulder and requested backup, saying he had two uncooperative individuals at a possible break-in location. Raymond closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the inevitability of what was about to happen. Maria started recording on her cell phone, murmuring that this was absolutely ridiculous and that she was going to make sure everyone saw what was happening. Morrison ordered her to stop recording, but Maria completely ignored him, keeping the phone pointed in his direction. The tension in the diner was so thick you could cut it with a knife. 3 minutes later, another patrol car stopped outside. 2 officers got out, both visibly older than Morrison. One of them was Sergeant Tom Daniels, a man in his early 40s with gray hair and a tired expression of someone who had seen a lot in his career. The other was Officer Karen Hughes, a 15-year veteran that Raymond recognized immediately. Karen had had coffee at Carter's Diner at least once a week for the past 5 years. She knew Raymond. She knew the restaurant's history. When Karen entered through the door and saw Raymond standing next to the table with his hands visible, while Morrison was tense and defensive, her expression instantly changed from professional to confused. Karen looked at Morrison, then at Raymond, and then asked what the hell was going on. Morrison began to explain that he had responded to a break-in call and found these 2 individuals in the establishment refusing to leave. Before he could finish, Karen interrupted him. She pointed directly at Raymond and said that this man was Raymond Carter, the owner of Carter's Diner, and that Morrison clearly hadn't done even the most basic verification before calling for backup. Her voice had a mixture of disbelief and frustration that made Morrison visibly shrink. Sergeant Daniels rubbed his face with his hands, already realizing they had a potential disaster on their hands. Raymond remained quiet, letting Karen handle Morrison. He saw the exact moment when the full realization hit the young officer. Morrison's face went pale. His eyes finally swept the diner for real, actually looking this time at the photos on the walls, at the business license, at all the obvious signs he had ignored because he had instantly decided that a young black man sitting alone in a restaurant before opening had to be a burglar. Maria was still recording everything, and now she narrated for the camera that Officer Hughes had just confirmed what she and Raymond had been saying all along. Sergeant Daniels asked Morrison to step outside and wait by the patrol car. Morrison obeyed silently, with his tail between his legs, knowing he had just made a career-ending mistake. Karen approached Raymond with an expression that mixed shame and anger. She apologized profusely, saying this should never have happened, that Morrison was new and clearly hadn't followed any proper protocol. Raymond nodded, but his jaw was tight. He wasn't interested in apologies at that moment. He was interested in understanding how a police officer could enter a registered commercial establishment, completely ignore all visible evidence of legitimate ownership, and treat the owner as a criminal based on nothing but skin color. Karen didn't have a good answer for that because they both knew exactly what had happened and why. Sergeant Daniels came in and formally introduced himself to Raymond, asking to speak privately. Raymond agreed, and the 2 went to a corner of the diner, away from Maria, who still held her phone like a weapon. Daniels explained he would make a complete report of the incident, that Morrison would be disciplined, and that the department took this kind of mistake very seriously. But as Daniels spoke, Raymond could see in his eyes that the sergeant was more concerned with damage control than real justice. Daniels was calculating how to minimize the situation, how to get Raymond to accept an apology and move on without making waves. Raymond stopped Daniels mid-sentence and said something that left the sergeant visibly uncomfortable. He said he wasn't interested in internal reports or promises of additional training, that this wasn't about a rookie officer making an honest mistake. It was about racial profiling, about an officer who saw a black man and immediately assumed criminal without even considering alternatives. Raymond said he was going to hire a lawyer, that he was going to sue both Morrison and the police department, and that he was going to make sure this became public so that maybe, just maybe, the next black business owner wouldn't have to go through the humiliation of proving they belonged in their own establishment. Daniels tried to argue that suing would be a long, difficult road, that maybe they could resolve this another way. He mentioned the department could make a contribution to Raymond's business, a form of compensation without admission of guilt. Raymond almost laughed at the audacity. They were trying to buy him off before the incident even cooled down. He told Daniels he wasn't for sale, that he wasn't going to accept hush money to make an inconvenient problem disappear, that his father and grandfather had built Carter's Diner with dignity, and he wasn't going to betray that legacy by accepting crumbs to hide injustice. Maria approached at that moment, showing Raymond her phone. She had sent the video to 3 different social media groups and already had over 200 views. She had also called 2 local reporters who were regular customers of the diner. Raymond thanked Maria, knowing she had done exactly what he would have done. Making it public was the only way to ensure it wouldn't be swept under the rug. Daniels was visibly bothered to learn the incident was already circulating online. He asked Raymond to consider waiting before speaking to the press, giving the department time to conduct a proper investigation. Raymond looked around his diner, at the empty tables that in an hour would be full of customers, at the counter where he had served thousands of meals, at the photos on the wall showing generations of his family. He thought about how many times he had heard stories of other black business owners being treated with suspicion in their own properties, thought about how many times he himself had been followed in stores, questioned in places where he had every right to be, treated as if he didn't belong. And he decided this time would be different. He told Daniels he wasn't going to wait, that he wasn't going to stay quiet, and that if the police department really took racial discrimination seriously, they should demonstrate it through real actions, not empty promises made in private conversations, trying to avoid bad publicity. The story exploded on social media before Carter's Diner even opened for breakfast. Maria's video showing Morrison demanding Raymond leave his own restaurant was shared thousands of times in the first hours. Regular customers of the diner began showing up not just for coffee, but to show support. By 7 in the morning, there was a line at the door of people wanting to eat at Carter's and make clear they stood with Raymond. Reporters from 3 local news stations arrived with cameras requesting interviews. Raymond agreed to speak, but only after serving his regular customers first. He wasn't going to let Morrison ruin the routine he had built so carefully. Raymond hired a civil rights attorney named David Chen the next morning. David reviewed Maria's video, heard Raymond's complete account, and said without hesitation they had a solid case. Morrison had violated Raymond's constitutional rights by detaining him without probable cause on his own property. More importantly, there was a clear pattern of racial profiling that couldn't be denied or explained away. David explained they would sue Morrison personally and the police department for civil rights violations, false arrest, and emotional suffering. The amount he suggested seeking was $650,000, enough to send a clear message that this behavior had real consequences. The police department tried to get ahead of the lawsuit by issuing a public statement 3 days after the incident. They said Officer Morrison had been placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation was conducted, and that the department did not tolerate discrimination of any kind. But the statement rang hollow, especially when investigative reporters discovered Morrison had a history. During his 6 months on the force, he had made disproportionate stops of black drivers, 3 times more than the average of other rookie officers. There were 2 informal complaints filed by citizens alleging unfair treatment, but none had resulted in formal investigation. The department had ignored the warning signs. Public pressure intensified when civil rights organizations got involved. The local NAACP organized a peaceful demonstration outside the police station, demanding not only Morrison's dismissal, but systemic reforms in police training on implicit bias. Black business owners from across the city began sharing their own stories of being questioned, followed, or treated with suspicion in their own establishments. Raymond's case became a symbol of something much bigger than a single incident. It was about decades of accumulated microaggressions, of constantly having to prove you belonged in spaces you had every right to occupy. The lawsuit was officially filed 6 weeks after the incident. David Chen organized a press conference on the courthouse steps where Raymond spoke publicly for the first time since the initial interviews. He was calm, articulate, and completely focused. Raymond explained he wasn't doing this for revenge or money. He was doing this because he believed real change only happened when people were held accountable for their actions. That Morrison had looked at him and seen only stereotypes, ignoring all evidence to the contrary. And that if this could happen to him, a 3rd-generation business owner in a well-established restaurant, it could happen to any black person anywhere. The police department's response to the lawsuit was predictable. Their lawyers argued Morrison had acted in good faith based on a call about a possible break-in, that he followed standard procedures, and that any error was honest and not motivated by racial discrimination. But David Chen had too much evidence working in Raymond's favor. Maria's video showing Morrison ignoring Raymond's explanations. Witness statements, including from Karen Hughes, who confirmed any basic verification, would have revealed the truth. Records showing Morrison's pattern of stops. And, most devastating, the fact that Morrison never even properly looked at the business license on the wall or the photos of the Carter family before deciding Raymond was a burglar. The defense began crumbling before the trial even started. The case never went to trial. 8 months after the incident at Carter's Diner, the police department's lawyers contacted David Chen proposing a settlement. They knew taking this to court would be a public relations disaster. The video was too clear. The witnesses were too credible. Morrison's pattern of behavior was too well documented. A jury would see exactly what millions of people had already seen online: a young black man being treated as a criminal in his own business for no other reason than the color of his skin. The department offered $400,000 to settle quietly. Raymond refused immediately. David came back with a counteroffer: $650,000, permanent dismissal of Morrison from the police force without possibility of reinstatement, revocation of his police certification so he couldn't simply get a job at another department, and mandatory implementation of expanded racial bias training for all department officers. More importantly, Raymond demanded a public apology from the police chief, specifically acknowledging that his treatment was the result of racial profiling. Not vague words about misunderstandings, real acknowledgement of what had happened and why. The department took 3 weeks to respond. They accepted all terms. The settlement ceremony was held at Carter's Diner at Raymond's request. Police Chief Robert McMahon had to stand there, in the same place where Morrison had humiliated Raymond, and read a prepared statement admitting that Officer Morrison had racially profiled Raymond Carter and violated his constitutional rights, that the department had systemic failures in its training that allowed implicit biases to manifest in discriminatory actions, that they were committed to doing better. News cameras captured every second. Regular customers of the diner were present. Maria was there, recording on her cell phone again, making sure it was documented. Morrison was formally fired the day after the settlement. His police certification was revoked by the state board, making it impossible to work in law enforcement anywhere. Some of his supporters argued he was young, that he had made a mistake, that his entire life shouldn't be ruined by one incident. But Raymond had a different perspective on that. When reporters asked if he thought the punishment was fair, Raymond responded that Morrison had made choices, chose to ignore obvious evidence, chose to escalate the situation even when corrected, chose to let prejudices guide his actions. Choices had consequences, and maybe losing his career would teach Morrison what no amount of training apparently had. Raymond used part of the settlement money to renovate Carter's Diner, updating kitchen equipment that had been running for decades. He also established a scholarship fund called Carter's Legacy for black students from the community who wanted to pursue careers in hospitality or entrepreneurship. The other part of the money went to local FISC and civil rights organizations working on police reform. Raymond didn't want to just sit on the money. He wanted to transform his painful experience into something that benefited others, that perhaps prevented young black people from going through what he went through. The impact of the case extended far beyond the financial settlement. The police department implemented 60 mandatory annual hours of implicit bias training for all officers. They created a community oversight panel with real power to investigate discrimination complaints. Traffic stops now required detailed documentation of probable cause, and most importantly, Raymond's case became an example used in police academies throughout the state about what not to do, about how unchecked biases could destroy careers and lives. Carter's Diner continued operating as it always had, opening at 6 in the morning every day, serving the community that had supported Raymond when he needed it most. But now there were new photos on the walls, images from the support rally, newspaper clippings about the settlement, and a small sign near the door that simply said, "Everyone is welcome here. Always have been. Always will be." Raymond still arrived at 5:15 every morning, still sat at the same table by the window with his coffee mug and paperwork. But now when he saw police cars pass by, he didn't just feel the old apprehension that black men learned to carry. He also felt something new, satisfaction from knowing he had fought and won, that he had used his voice and resources to create real change, that the next black business owner who was questioned on their own property would have a legal precedent to point to. The story of Raymond Carter and Officer Morrison became more than just a court case. It became a reminder that justice was possible when people refused to accept the unacceptable, when they documented the truth, and when they fought not just for themselves, but for everyone who would come after. Carter's Diner had survived 3 generations, serving the community with dignity. Now it had served the community in a different way, proving that even against the power of a police department, truth and justice could still prevail.